Well, welcome everyone to, this is the 343rd meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a series that has been going on since 2012, founded by Ben Catcher, a cartoonist and educator, in service of inviting people who make comics, people who think about comics, people who write about comics, to be asked to present to an audience in New York about any issue related to comics of their choosing. It's completely free form. And Ben is on sabbatical this year. He's done this series for over a decade. And my name's Austin English. I am curating and administrating this season. And when I was figuring out who to curate for this season, one of the first people I thought of was tonight's guest, Megan Kelso, who we're honored to have here. I spend a lot of time reading comics and thinking about comics and working with comics. And Megan's work has always been, to me, one of the most singular achievements in comics for every book that she publishes. I think one thing that Megan's work reveals to me is how it really shows how hard comics can be when you look at the vast variety of comics published. When I look at other work, they rarely have the quality that Megan's work has, of having this multi kind of faceted presentation of ensemble casts of characters. Rarely do I see an expression of comics that have the depth and a combination of anger and sympathy and humanity that I see across all her characters in every one of her works. So it was the clear first choice to invite Megan to speak for this season, and we're honored to have her here. She has a new book out, and this is also broadcasting online, so I'm admitting people to watch it simultaneously as I'm speaking to you. Megan has a new book out. It will be out in bookstores on November 1st, but you guys are all very lucky because we have copies available today, advanced copies that the true debut of Megan's new book, Who Will Make the Pancakes, is today. So we're very happy about that. And I also want to mention, he's not here right now. I guess he's out working in the bookstore, but Eli of Unnameable Books. Oh, no, he's right here. I didn't even notice that. Eli of Unnameable Books has been very helpful putting this event together and a previous event that the symposium had with Inez Estrada. Eli would like you guys to know that there are readings at Unnameable throughout the rest of this month. And he encourages you, when you're checking out Megan's new book, in the bookstore, there is a sign-up list that you can sign up to hear about future events. Just a word about the symposium. The symposium is really set up for for audiences to interact with the guests that we have in the series. So for people watching this online and for you guys here, if you have a question for Megan as her presentation goes on, for those of you online, you can write it into the chat. And we will get to your question or comment when Megan's presentation is over. For you guys here, you can just be old-fashioned and write the question or comment in your head and then present it to us at the appropriate time. So I will just now read a quick biography of Megan, and then I will get out of the way and we will have tonight's guest. So following a brief stint at art school, Megan Kelso completed her BA at the Evergreen State College in 1991, where she studied history and political science. Inspired by the explosion of zines, bands, and DIY art projects in Olympia, she started her Girlhero mini comic, which ran for 6 issues. She was the first woman to receive the Xeric Foundation self-publishing grant. In 1998, comics from Girlhero were compiled into a book published by Highwater titled Queen of the Black Black. Kelso received 2 Ignatz Awards for her graphic novel Artichoke Tales. In 2007, she was invited by the New York Times Magazine to serialize her Watergate Sue comic as part of a weekly Funny Pages feature. In 2019, she was selected for a public art commission as part of the Climate Pledge Arena renovation in Seattle Center. The piece, Commute, was installed in December 2021. Kelso's 3rd collection of short stories, Who Will Make the Pancakes, will debut. The text here says something else, but the reality is that it debuts tonight. So without further ado, here's Megan Kelso.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Okay. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. Thanks for the introduction, Austin.
Oh, of course.
A month ago, I went to SPX, which is a comics show in Bethesda, Maryland, and I attended a panel called Comics and Fabulism. And it was great. And Gabrielle Bell was on it. She's here tonight. And a woman named Daryl Sidecheck and another cartoonist named Kit Anderson and another cartoonist named Rumi Hara. And it was fascinating. They talked about the ways that unreality and dreams, how they worked those kinds of things into their comics. And, you know, I knew the word fabulism, but I guess I didn't really know what it meant. And I looked it up later, and the definition is a literary form in which fantastical elements are placed into an everyday setting. And I thought, oh yeah, I wasn't able to like really throw that word around, but like, that's totally what I like to do. And so I started thinking about it, and that's kind of what I want to talk about tonight. So fabulism. The last talk that I gave about my comics, I talked about what drives my work, but thinking about fabulism made me realize I wanted to talk about like the strategies I use to make the stories that I make. But I have to back up a little first and talk about my mom. This is a picture of her I took of her at IKEA trying out a desk. She died 5 years ago, and this picture was actually just a few months before she died. And it's not like a great picture of her, but I like it. And the funny thing is that like she hated fabulism and fantasy and stories that had made up elements. She liked naturalism, realism, things that were true. But she's a huge influence on me. And in a lot of ways, she's kind of my muse, which is a little embarrassing to have your mother be your muse. But she was an English major. She was a great storyteller. She was really good with specific detail. And she helped me a lot in high school, especially with my writing. But I think one of the biggest influences she had on me was that she loved voices. She really noticed the quality of people's voices and would point them out and imitate people. And she also loved pointing out people who had terrible voices. and I realize now that like that's a huge part of the way I work, is sort of like imagining the voices of my characters. So yeah, so my mom is like a real strong presence in this book. And also, my sister is here tonight, and I dedicated this book to my sister. She's over here there she is, Jenny Kelso, Jenny Smith. And so now I'm gonna get started, now that you know all that personal stuff. So comics, because they're drawn by hand, they're already a bit distanced from what we think of as reality. And so I think that all kinds of comics, mainstream, superhero, art comics, they all accommodate visual metaphors really well. And visual metaphors can be a kind of fabulism. This is a story called Frozen Angel. It was one of the very first comic stories I ever made in 1992. It's about a girl who gets broken up with, gets her heart broken, and she cuts her heart out because she doesn't want that bullshit anymore. And this frozen angel flies in through her window and flies into her chest cavity. And I guess, you know, like the way metaphors work, we all share this kind of cultural imagery and baggage and knowledge. So one of the things that I kind of figured out early on, that working with metaphor, one of the things that was great was that you didn't have to explain a whole lot. They could do a lot of heavy lifting in your storytelling, because you could pretty much count on people knowing what an angel was and like what a frozen angel living inside your chest might mean. You could kind of let your reader figure that out for themselves, and let the reader make their own connections. And that kind of approach, I guess, I've continued over the years. So this is one of the stories in the new book. It's called The Golden Lasso. And it's probably the most autobiographical story I've ever done. I had a very outdoorsy childhood. I did a lot of wilderness trips, backpacking and rock climbing. And that's mainly what this story is about. But the main character, whose name is Diana, who's basically a stand-in for me, she buys this plastic clothesline and it becomes her golden lasso, like Wonder Woman's lasso of truth. And, you know, pretty much everybody in our culture knows who Wonder Woman is and knows that she had a magic lasso of truth. And so again, like, I don't need to do a lot of explaining. Like, you, the reader, pretty much get what that means. And so I can kind of like get on with the story and have this metaphor kind of sitting there making you think about, well, why? You know, why does she have it? One of the rules I made for myself in the story about the golden lasso is that everything that Diana ever heard when she would ask questions would be like a hard, unpleasant, and difficult truth. So another source of fabulism in my work is stuff from childhood. Children don't tend to have strict boundaries between what's real and what's imaginary. And some kids more than other kids, but I was definitely one of those kids. So this is a picture of me and Jenny and my mom. This is around 1974. So I was 6 years old. And one of the stories in this book, Watergate Sue, is all about the Watergate scandal, which ends with Nixon resigning in 1974. So that's how old I was when all that happened. The main kid character in the story I made actually a little bit younger, because I wanted her to still be like preschool age and mostly at home. So kids, I don't know if you guys have kids, but they really don't know anything. But at the same time, they're really smart, and they're always trying to make connections and like figure stuff out based on the small things that they do know. And one of my vivid memories of my parents were just obsessed with Watergate, my mother especially, and she listened to the hearings and she listened to the news, and then she would tell my dad about it at night when he came home from work, and like all these new words. And so like in this little interchange, they're talking about a subpoena, and Josie's like, I know that word. It's like penis, right? Like they're like the same thing, right? And the mom's like, no. But that kind of like kid confusion is something that I've always really enjoyed working with. So here's another part of Watergate Sue. I had these little strips that were just they were kind of like peanuts, in the sense that like the grown-ups were very much in the background. It was mostly Josie's reality. And she is sort of convinced that her mailman is Nixon. Like they kind of seem like the same person to her. And this is totally based on a memory I have. We had this mailman, he had this very heavy brow and dark hair, and he was always frowning, and he kind of looked like Nixon. And I kind of knew they weren't the same person, but I kind of didn't know. Like I just really like conflated them in my head. And I've talked to other people about this, and they've acknowledge that they had weird stuff like that when they were kids, where they kind of blended fantasy and reality. So here's another family picture. You can see I have the Josie haircut, even though I am now like 13 years old. I had that haircut for a really long time. So when I started drawing Watergate Sue, I knew Josie had to have that haircut. So another source of fabulism for me are my dreams. And I pay a lot of attention to my dreams, and sometimes I write them down. A lot of times I bore my husband with them. But I know that the actual raw material of dreams is like not that interesting to other people. So how do you turn what seems like this really arresting experience you've had for yourself into a story that will be interesting to other people? And I would say that the fabulism in my work, most of it, when it appears, comes from something that happened in a dream, but that's just like a jumping off point. So an example is that in around 2011, my daughter was 5 years old. It was peak Downton Abbey. Everybody I knew was watching Downton Abbey, including me. And I had this dream that I lived in the same house that I live in now, which is quite a small house, but I had an entire staff of servants like they had in Downton Abbey. And it was wonderful. They did everything for me, except it was also horrible because we were all packed into this tiny house and we were just like on top of each other, and it was really awkward. And I told everybody about this dream. I just loved this dream. And then my daughter had just started kindergarten. I had a little bit more time, and I sat down one day and I did this drawing, and I don't know why exactly I turned the servants into cats. I think it was just that I was really enjoying drawing cats with clothes at the time. And so this was sort of like my jumping off point for this story in the book, Cats in Service. And I had just finished a graphic novel, Artichoke Tales, which had been a long project, and I had mostly scripted it out, written in advance, thumbnailed it, and then drew it. And I was really frustrated with that process because I've always gotten image ideas first, and then I would translate them into writing because I was more comfortable with writing than with drawing. But I always knew that it was an image first. And after Artichoke Tales, I was like, I really want to change the way I work. I want the image and those initial drawings to be the generative process for me, not the writing. And so this story, Cats in Service, is kind of where I began really figuring out how to work that way. So what I started with is I just drew what I think of as wish fulfillment. Like I just started drawing these cats doing my laundry and doing my dishes and looking after my kid and dusting and just cleaning the hell out of my house, mowing my lawn, everything. Pages and pages. There was no story, you guys. There was no story. It was just pages and pages of cats doing housework. And, it took a while to turn into a story. And I wrote stuff, and then I erased it, and then I wrote new stuff. And slowly the story kind of emerged, which kind of resulted from me saying, well, how did these cats get here? Why are they wearing these outfits? And that's kind of how I started making it into a narrative. And if you read the book, you'll find out how the cats got there and why they're wearing these outfits. So another story in the book called The Egg Room also had its origins in a dream. And again, it wasn't a very interesting dream. It was a shopping dream. I have a lot of shopping dreams. It was this beautiful department store that had a food hall, and one of the rooms in the food hall was all eggs, and eggs from all different kinds of birds, and some of them were edible and some of them were just decorative, and it was just gorgeous. It was one of those dreams, just like in Technicolor, just unbelievably beautiful. And so I just knew immediately, like, I want to do a comic that has this egg room in it. But again, I had no idea what the story would be. And one of the things that I experience when I finish a book is that I immediately forget the struggle of making the stories. Like, once the story is a finished thing, it's really hard to remember what it was like when I had no idea what it was. So I decided to like really make an effort to kind of dissect, like, how did the egg room go from just this cool shopping dream to like a real story? I went on a residency a year or so after I had this dream, and I had 3 weeks to just work on comics. It was really, really cool. And I wanted to start new stories, and so the egg room was on my list. And so what I told myself to do was just draw the stuff I can actually picture now. Like, don't try and make anything new up, but like, there were a few scenes that I knew I wanted to have. This little girl shopping around for an egg, and it had some kind of like importance to the rest of her life. Like, she was choosing the egg in a way that would impact the rest of her life. And that's kind of all I knew at the time. So I drew that. And then I had this drawing in my sketchbook from a few years ago, earlier, before I even had a kid. I'd been in a bus station in Spokane, Washington, and I watched this young mother with these 2 boys who I assume were her sons. And I don't know what was going on with them, but there was trouble. And I was really like nosy and fascinated by it. And I drew them. And I've taken a class from the cartoonist Linda Berry before. And one of the things she says in her class is, notice what you pay attention to. And, you know, I spent a lot of time on this drawing and I kept thinking about it. So I knew something was there, even though I didn't really know what it was. And I've heard another writer, although I can't remember who it was, say, like, pay attention when you feel heat. And like, I felt heat from this whole situation with this mother and these 2 boys, even though I didn't know what it was. And so I knew that I could somehow get something going with the egg room and this scene at the bus station. And then there was this bored mother at the playground that kind of was me, because you spend a lot of time at playgrounds with little kids and it's pretty boring. And this mother was a filmmaker. And so she's sitting there kind of trying to keep an eye on her kid, but she's like imagining this film she wants to make. So I'm getting this stuff together, and now we get into like my theory of storytelling, which is the giant ball of yarn theory, which is like, the more stuff you can kind of like wrap up. There was a video game in the mid 2000s that was like this giant ball that rolled all over the world, and it was sticky and it collected everything. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, that's how I think. That's how I get a story going, is I get one of those giant balls going and it picks all this stuff up. So I've got the filmmaker mother, I've got the bus station, I've got the egg room. Then I started to think about like foodie culture was like really heating up, fancy food stores. And like, I was starting to sort of feel like an old woman, because like I would notice like really handsome young guys who were like way too young for me, and like just realizing like, wow, what am I doing? So like I was mixing all this stuff up in my yarn ball. But I kept coming back to like, the egg room has to be so beautiful, and how to draw it and how to portray that gorgeousness.
Stop
So
it.
I would occasionally just draw stuff like this. And I do this a lot when I'm making stories. Like I call it like non-goal oriented drawing. Like I'm trying to figure out what something looks like, but I'm not like forcing myself to put it into comics form. So I'm starting to get like a rough draft of this story, and I don't really thumbnail. It doesn't work for me. I like to actually draw almost the size that the final art's gonna be, because like I'm just, every time I draw, I'm like figuring out more about this world, about the story, about the characters. And I found that with thumbnails, I don't learn. I only like learn more about the story from actually trying to draw it. So these are kind of sloppy drawings, as you can see. They're not meant to be final drawings. They're on notebook paper, and I'm not like rendering everything, but I'm still getting somewhere with who these characters are. And I don't know if you can tell, but like these are two separate pieces of paper. Like there's a lot of cutting and pasting going on, rearranging, panel order, and then like realizing there's like a tiny panel here, because I realized like something needs to go before this. So I added that in, and then something that I wind up getting little panels in the margin.
I have to take care of myself.
I start to figure out the order.
You know?
Did I hear someone say something?
Someone there might be.
Oh, okay.
Let's not worry about it.
Okay, I won't worry about it. So I also do a lot of erasing of text. Like, again, like the image usually is where the like truth of what I want to do comes from. And so I'll write something and I'll be like, that's bullshit. I don't think that. I don't want that character to say that, but I'll still like the setting. So I'll just erase the writing. And I kind of keep the text open until the very last minute, because I never quite know until the last minute if that part's going to be right. Meanwhile, I am doing a lot of writing because what I found, like sort of switching up my process, is that writing, for me at least, is great for problem solving. Like if I don't quite know how something fits together, or I still don't understand a character, or like this situation, like, does she actually kiss the guy, or does she, the young guy, does she like just imagine kissing the young guy? Does he interested in kissing her? Like, what's up with that? I had to write a lot about them to figure that part out. And so writing becomes my problem solving tool more than my generative tool. I also outline a lot. I probably did, over the years that I worked on this story, maybe 10 different outlines of the story. I really, like, structure is really, really important to me. It's kind of like the key to making a story work. And so some of my outlines are like aspirational, like this is the structure, this is what I really want it to be. And then other outlines are like what I call State of the Union outlines, like this is really where it's at right now, this is actually the sequence of events in this story. And then, like, I guess hopefully eventually the aspirational outline and the State of the Union outline come together. I read an article by John McPhee in the New Yorker a few years ago about how he's really obsessed with structure, and he tries to sort of figure out structure first before he begins writing. Like he just kind of needs to. And I was in utter sympathy with him. And I take a lot of notes. I have, this is pretty typical of people. I have ideas while I'm walking. I have ideas when I can't sleep. I sometimes have good ideas in the shower and while I'm doing dishes, whatever. I jot it down on whatever's at hand. And I like really try not to lose those notes, because I'm terrified that if I don't, I'll just forget it if I don't hold on to it. One of the things that started to interfere with my creative process was Bluetooth headphones, because that allowed me to listen to podcasts while I went for walks. And I just, I just kind of became obsessed during the Trump administration and then the pandemic with like, please, some podcast will like tell me what's wrong, what's going on. And I just was sort of desperate for answers, and I sacrificed a lot of good walking, thinking time, listening to too many podcasts, and nobody had the answers. So it's all been a waste of time. So finally, I did finish a draft of this story, and I was playing around. I knew it was going to be full color. I wanted to do it in watercolor, but I didn't know how to do watercolor, and I just could do watercolor a little bit, but I was really frustrated. Finally decided, you know, I'm going to take a watercolor class. So I signed up for this adult, you know, art class at a local, I don't even know what to call it. It's not like you can get a degree there, but they teach very traditional, like drawing, painting, and realistic art. And I took watercolor 101. And this is one of my assignments, and I am sharing it with you because it kind of got at what I wanted the egg room to look like. Like I wanted it to be lush, and I wanted there to be blurred boundaries and edges, because I thought that would kind of communicate the dream quality of this story. So this is a page where I'm like messing around with color palettes, and there's this up at the top is a actual panel from the comic. But after playing around with that, I realized like, no, I really don't want lines in this story. Like I was really fascinated learning watercolor that you're always talking about edges in watercolor. They're either like soft edges or hard edges, but there aren't really lines. And I thought, yeah, I want to figure out a way to like create this whole comic with just edges. And so here's a page I really like. I don't like all the pages. What I also learned with watercolor is like things can go wrong quickly. But I just kind of forced myself to live with a lot of imperfection. And just kind of was like, move on to the next page. I'd already been working on this story for like a ridiculous number of years. You don't even want to know. So I didn't overthink the watercolor. Like some of them are a little awkward, whatever. But anyway, this is a page I'm really happy with. And I'm going to share a couple other panels that I'm really happy with. I think I have an insomnia panel in basically every comic I do because I struggle with it a lot. And it just really somehow cheers me up to like force my characters to have insomnia as well. And then this panel I really love, but it also illustrates something that was a big influence in the story, which was like having a kid forced me to like become interested in things I had absolutely no interest in, like video games. And one of the things I kind of learned is that whole first-person shooter perspective that so many video games have is the dream perspective. I mean, I don't know if all dreams are from that first-person shooter, but most of my dreams are from that perspective. And so I was like, oh, right, that's how I need to draw the dream panels to make it feel like it's a dream. And I basically learned that from paying more attention to video games. And also one of the characters in this story, this is Philip. He's a boy who's extremely attached to video games. So I just borrowed some of the stuff that I would overhear my daughter like talking about and what she was playing around with. So this is my last slide. This is my conclusion. I wanted to come back to that John McPhee article. Another thing he said is that he just, as much as he wanted to be a more efficient writer, he finally just had to like make his peace with the fact that he had to do at least 3 drafts. I can't remember actually how many drafts he said he had to do, but it was kind of a lot. Maybe it was 4. And, you know, maybe other people write more efficiently, but like, that's just how it was for him. And he just had to face it. And I was like, yes, I get you, John McPhee. But anyway, this is a panel from that Golden Lasso story. And it's pretty much me. I love to walk. I love to hike. And moving into the future, thinking about like what I'm going to do next, mainly what I'm trying to do is like get my brain back from podcasts and like be okay with my own thoughts on walks again, because I know that really is for me kind of like the source of where my stories come from. So that's where I'm wrapping it up. Thanks.
So let me just do this. One moment. Does anyone in the audience want to start off with a question for Megan? And anyone who's watching this online, you can write a question you have in the chat, and we'll try to alternate between both. Do you want to ask a question?
Did I learn to be what?
At what point did you learn to be conscious in your process?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Well, when I first started drawing comics, I didn't come from like having grown up reading a lot of comics. Like I enjoyed like the newspaper strips, but I didn't read comic books much. And I was flying a little blind at first. And I found it so hard to like get just a panel together where you get like, where do you put the word balloon? Because the word balloon's like overlapping your whole drawing. Like how do you even do that? And for the first couple years, I felt like it was just this overwhelming puzzle just to sort of wrangle all the elements together to you know, get everything in place. And I didn't feel any consciousness about it. I just felt like it was like this constant struggle. And then one day I was working on a story called Whistle and Queenie. And I had thoughts like, oh, I'm going to use this strategy. I'm going to like expand this panel to, I had just read Understanding Comics, I think. The like brilliant idea that like if you make the panel longer, it feels like it takes up more time. And if you make the panel shorter, it feels faster. And I suddenly had like the brain space to make decisions like that. And it really, I think that's what maybe what you're asking. Like I finally felt like I had enough ability that I could start making sort of more finely grained decisions about how to make the comic. I would say I was maybe like 3 years into it when that happened.
There's a question from someone online here this is Tatiana Lowe asks, thank you for sharing your process. Can you talk about how you go through slumps during your creative process?
Yeah. Well, so I did that story, Watergate Sue, for the New York Times in 2007. Like I started basically in January and finished in like late September, I think. And it was, you know, New York Times Magazine is a weekly magazine. So it was just this like pace. I was doing a page of comics a week, which I don't know, maybe doesn't sound like much, but it was a lot for me. And I had to, the story was in print before I could finish it, if that makes sense. Like the first page of the story was already running before I had even figured out the end of the story. So I was just like on a hamster wheel with that story, and I just felt extremely burned out when it was done. Not like I'm never drawing comics again, but like I have no interest in drawing any comics in the near future. And I was just kind of like drained of all creativity is what it felt like. And it was sad, you know, it was hard. And I wrote in my journal a lot. I've always kept a journal, not sometimes more regularly than others, but like I started when I was like in 7th grade, maybe. So it's a pretty strongly ingrained habit. And I took a lot of solace from having my journal when I couldn't make comics. And I mean, there have been other times when I really haven't, like when my mom was really sick. My mom, she had dementia and she required a lot of care. And it just took up a lot of my time and my energy. And I really, there were times when I just really couldn't do comics, and writing in my journal was solace. And interestingly, a lot of stuff that wound up in Who Will Make the Pancakes were like little flits of ideas that I like wrote down in my journal at that time when I really wasn't doing any comics. And I didn't really put any pressure on myself at the time, like, I will make this a story. But like, I did go back and was like, oh, that was kind of a cool idea. So, yeah.
Does someone else in the audience have a question? There's a question waiting for there, but we can, yes.
I'm really interested in that you have these two different approaches for creating narrative. You started your natural thing started with, I start with the words, and you're like, nah, I'm not going to do the images. And so what I want to ask is, when you were using images to start your storytelling, I remember you were saying problem solving when you were working with images. And I guess in terms of the actual structure of narrative, like there's going to be a thing, and then there's this thing, like the actual putting together of the story. Is that are words integral to that process for you, or when you were doing image-based generation, was it actually quiet in your brain? Like, was it just you were just working purely with image to figure out story, or is words integral to your process of figuring out the actual narrative?
Well, like that. Let's see if I can go back to.
And could we just? I'm just going to repeat the question for the people. Sorry to interrupt. Just
sure.
for the people that are here who can't hear the audience as well. Just how integral? What would it be? What would be an easy way to sum it up for them? How integral images and thinking about words are?
Our words, when you were doing image-based story creation, did you need the words to sequence your narrative, or were you able to stay purely in image as you were figuring that part out?
Did you need words to sequence your narrative, or were you thinking in image when you were working that out?
I didn't need words to sequence the images, but it wasn't a completely silent process, Mila. It was like I knew some words, and like here's a really good example. Like I was talking about how like I just drew when I started the egg room at that residency. I just drew what I knew, like because I had like a scene that I kept kind of seeing of this little girl going in and being supervised while she picked an egg, and it was this really important, momentous thing. And so the writing here is, and what you choose, you will not see again for many years. And like that was very much a part of the very first idea of it, those words. So I put those words down, but I didn't like force myself to put in a bunch more words because I didn't know them yet. And that's what I would try and hold back on, is like really just try to stick to the stuff that I could really see, and then like take some time to like mull that over, and then start to figure out how like more words could like knit it together.
And go back here.
My uncle is in the online audience. Hey, Uncle Jim.
Howard asks, what is your inspiration for reflections on childhood, and why do you think you are drawn to this phase of life?
Oh, well, I didn't want to grow up, I guess, is the best way of putting that. My grandmother had a friend named Zori who lived in the same house her entire life. And that was like my goal. And I have weirdly, I mean, part of it is keeping a journal, but I have like weirdly worked my entire life to not forget my childhood. And not because like my childhood was some sort of perfect experience. It just, I'm fascinated by it. And so I've really made a lot of effort to try to remember as much as I can and to hold on to it.
Is there an audience question that we can go to? Yes.
I was thinking back to the very first image you showed of the ice sphere.
Oh yeah.
And
The frozen
I was
angel.
just curious, like your journey through aesthetics, or like how you think about style, and I have no idea what the chronology is between that image and the book that is being released today. But I'm just curious about your journey of aesthetics, I guess.
Okay.
The question was the journey of maybe different, the way Megan began drawing early in her career to the drawings that make up this book and the aesthetic journey.
Yeah, so this story was one of the very first stories I made. I think it was 1992, which I believe is 30 years ago, which seems crazy. And I was really like, in my early days of making comics, I had this idea, this like mistaken idea, I think, of like what comics should look like, because mostly what I had this idea that serious comics were like, like Alan Moore type stuff, like still in the like superhero world, but the kind of intellectual stuff. Give me some more names. Who else were doing
I think Alan
those
Moore makes sense.
intellectual superhero comics? That's what I thought. Like, okay, that's what I want to do. Except I didn't draw that way, so it wasn't comfortable. So this is like me kind of aping that style, but not really feeling at home in it. And then I got exposed to more kind of like alternative comic stuff, and seeing Julie Doucet's work was really a breakthrough, like a real watershed moment for me. Like, oh, she draws like how I wish I could draw, but like in the realm of what I was already, like how I was just comfortable drawing. Like Julie's work was much more like refined and accomplished, but that was kind of more the realm of aesthetic that I was doing. Like if I was just messing around, not trying to be a cartoonist. I mean, I was really more influenced by like children's book illustrators than I was, because I didn't really grow up reading comics. So then I started to feel, when I saw her work, and then I started, like I read Twisted Sisters, and I just started to see like, oh, you don't have to be drawing in this superhero idiom to be like taken seriously. That was a very freeing moment, and I realized I could more just kind of be myself and draw the way I drew for fun. So I kind of really changed pretty dramatically, after the first year or two.
You were when you began making work, you were part of a very close-knit scene of people in Seattle making comics and discussing their comics with each other. Was there an artist that might have been formative about those ideas at that time to you?
Yeah. I mean, like like this comic and the first issue of Girlhero, I did when I was still in college at Evergreen. And I knew a lot of people who were making zines and stuff, so they were kind of my models, but I didn't really have any friends who drew comics. And then when I graduated, moved to Seattle, luckily met a bunch of really cool cartoonists, Jason Lutz, James Sturm, David Lasky, Ellen Forney, Jennifer Daydreamer. And a lot of them were sort of farther along the path of sort of knowing how to make comics. And I learned a lot from them. And I would say I learned the most from Jason Lutz. Like Jason Lutz suggested, there's nothing wrong with using like just capital letters at the beginning of a sentence, not comics in all capitals. And I was like, wow, I really like the way that looks. That's a good tip, Jason. It looks like regular writing, not like all capitals all the time. Because I was doing that because I thought that's how it was supposed to be in comics.
Was it mostly, were there things you remember, things like that, or was there maybe just the idea of, because that group of people, there was almost this maybe revolutionary idea to it of comics as a form of literary art that was independent of mainline literary fiction. Was it maybe, but when you look back on it, is it mostly more trading techniques and ideas of just how to make a comic, or was there a sense of doing something like a larger movement at the time?
Well, we talked about comics a lot. And I remember kind of hitting on this thing that I would repeat over and over to myself and also to people if they asked me, like, well, what do you mean you do comics? And I would say, and I had, like, we sort of developed this idea together. It's not revolutionary now, but it seemed revolutionary at the time, that comics is not a genre. Comics is a medium of expression. So that means that comics can be anything, because there were these very narrow ideas of what comics could be, which I totally, in an ignorant way, kind of fell into when I first started doing comics. And what I learned in that, like being part of that group and just spending all this time talking about comics and being introduced to new comics, was like, oh yes, this is just a box. You could put anything into this box. And so that was the kind of intellectual idea that I came away from. But I would say what I got mostly out of that group was really the nuts and bolts of how to make comics, from drawing stuff to like production stuff, all of it. We just all sort of shared, everything we knew, and different people had different, things they were stronger in.
I'm going to read a question from Tatiana. Artists often have a problem that they are trying to figure out. Do you have a sense of what you're trying to figure out with your work?
Not in an overarching way, but I definitely think that some stories come out of questions or things I'm confused about. And like the cat story, I mean, I was kind of joking around a lot with you guys about it, but like it really came out of like being a mom of a little kid, and also wanting to hold on to being an artist, and just there was just too much to do all the time, and life always just seemed out of control, and that the like dream of a staff of servants was real. And yet like I have a lot of discomfort with servitude and the whole structure of servitude. And so, I mean, I don't really think I solved it. I don't think I answered the question in that story, but it came out of like it's a real conundrum for people who like have work they want to do, and they also want to have families. And then there's all this work of homemaking and housekeeping and child rearing and paying other people to do some of it, but not all of it. You know, it's hard stuff. And so that story totally came out of like all that stuff swirling around in my head kind of all the time. Yeah.
Well, I have a question, but I will. Yes.
I guess I'm curious, and this is, jumping off what you're talking about, but I'm curious what you think about like a delineation of like autobiographical comics, and if you think like fiction exists, and
Okay.
The question was, does fiction exist, and in line with autobiocomics? The line of autobiocomics dovetailing into, does fiction exist?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. The short answer is yes. I think fiction exists. That is not to say that I and pretty much everyone else who writes fiction or draws fiction doesn't borrow heavily from our own experiences, memories, dreams, wishes. I mean, there's something that I've talked about for years about how I think my work is often autobiographical in terms of place. Two of the stories in this book take place in the house that I grew up in. I lived in the same house for the first 18 years of my life, and I still dream about getting that house back. Like, that's the house I wanted to be like Zori and live my entire life in. It didn't work out that way. But anyway, like, I have that floor plan of that house like burned into my brain. And like, it's fun for me to draw stories taking place in that house because it's like, it's just so familiar and easy, and also a little bit of wish fulfillment. Like, I go back there and live in that house while I'm drawing the story. So that's extremely autobiographical, right? But the events are like the Cats in Service story. There's no actual events in that story that are autobiographical. Another example is the egg room. Like, I took a lot of like my own feelings about aging and being an artist, and some of the things that I have the main characters say are things that I genuinely think or have said myself, but all the events of that story I drew from lots of different sources and made into a narrative. Now, the weird thing for me is in this book, I did this story, The Golden Lasso, which is like genuinely autobiographical, and probably the first time I've really ever attempted that. And it was really uncomfortable. And I don't imagine I'll be doing it again. I much prefer making up stories, because then I sort of have the choice to like include some stuff from my real life, but not everything. And I just feel like it gives me more power as a storyteller to make those kinds of fictional decisions.
You had said earlier, early in your life, your influences, or like you weren't exposed to comics early on, but you read a lot of illustrated work, like children's books.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have like favorites that were influences, and then also like are there contemporary children's illustrators that you
The question was, do you have children's books that you're interested, that you're highly influenced by, or contemporary children's books from the past and contemporary?
Yeah. So Beatrix Potter, for sure, and Garth Williams. He's illustrated a lot of books, but he illustrated Charlotte's Web and the Little House on the Prairie books. Dr. Seuss, Maurice Sendak, Lois Lenski, who illustrated these books called the Betsy Tacy Tibb books, which I read obsessively as a child. The list could go on. Then I did discover a bunch of new illustrators when I had a kid. They're not like super contemporary, but I totally fell in love with Rosemary Wells, so she's best known now for the TV show, kids TV show, Max and Ruby, about these two bunny rabbits. But her illustrated books are amazing, and I love them. And they weren't around, or I didn't know about them as a kid. And then another author illustrator I discovered, who I love, being a mother, was Kevin Henkes. He I don't know what he's most well known for, but he did this one book called Chrysanthemum, about a little girl whose name is Chrysanthemum, and everybody makes fun of her. But he's done a whole bunch of books, and he's kind of a cartoonist. Like some of his pages are like comics pages.
He lives in Madison, Wisconsin. So when I worked in the bookstore, he would come and like sign stock for us all the time. Like, he's a really sweet guy.
I love that guy so much.
Really cool. Yeah, he's a great illustrator.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the drawing you did in the bus station, because it was just and how you explained your process of just having all these fragments from like maybe even so long ago that led you into the story you're doing now. I wanted to ask, how do you harness the confidence to be like, okay, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I just like want to do this, and like maybe it'll come into my story, or maybe it'll be nothing. Like, how do you trust yourself?
How do you trust yourself to bring something into the story and trust that it'll work within the larger structure story?
Yeah, or just like even like when you're doing something that you don't even know what story you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
but like you just want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, like the not knowing.
Yeah.
Well, I drew comics for a good 10 years, not working this way, being kind of more controlling. And like I said, I when I first started drawing comics, I tended to write them out first, because even though I'd always liked to draw, I was just a much more confident writer. I was confident in my ability to write a story. I wasn't confident in my ability to draw a story. And so I would literally write a story and then almost like adapt it into a comic at first. Then I kind of like progressed to like writing a script in a more traditional comic script kind of way, and then start drawing. So I think that gave me confidence, like making some comics in that way. And it wasn't until I kind of had that experience under my belt that I was able to like sort of have that consciousness, like that other person asked me about consciousness, that I was mediating myself, that my ideas always were visual to begin with, and I would sort of purposefully translate into writing. And that if I could tap more directly into image stuff, that maybe I could make more interesting stories. And taking that class from Linda Berry really helped too. She talks a lot about sort of trying to be okay in that space of sort of not knowing where you're going, and kind of having a certain faith that you have a narrative way of working in your brain, and you kind of just need to trust it. But honestly, I don't think I could have started that way. Confidence is the exact word of what I didn't have at the beginning. I needed that writing provided me like a structure and a sort of comfort at first to make my first comics. And I'm willing now to like go out on a limb more, because I know I can do it.
Any other questions from the audience? We have time for more. Yes, in the very back.
I wanted to ask how like doing the for New York, the New York Times, like changed your process. I know that you stopped drawing, but did you find anything that was helpful?
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
going to repeat.
Thanks
just,
for asking.
Sorry to repeat every question. I just have to
Okay.
repeat it for the people here.
Yeah.
But did working for the New York Times Magazine on deadline change your process?
Talk about confidence. It was terrifying. It was terrifying because, like I said, like it was out. The first episode was out in the world in the magazine before I had the whole thing. Before I had an ending, I was just like, I was so not very far ahead the whole time. And when I finished, I sort of felt like I'd climbed Mount Everest, you know, like, okay, you know, come at me. I can do anything. You know, and I've felt that way permanently since then, but it was pretty powerful, like to have had an experience like that and managed to do it. And I definitely didn't ever feel scared of like assignments after that, you know, like if I would get an illustration job and I'd be like, oh my God, like I knew I could work under pressure in a way that I didn't really know before, because before, you know, I was self-publishing for a long time and then I worked with Fantagraphics, but like I was allowed to work on my own time most of the time. And having to produce comics under that kind of pressure and actually be able to do it, like I learned how to like rough quickly and don't worry about it, and then just like move on to the next thing. And then like when I would go back to my rough drawing, even though like at the time I was making it, I was just like, this is a bunch of bullshit scribbles, at least it was something on the paper. And when I would go back and look at it, I would think, okay, there's something here. I have something to work with. And that was a really good lesson. And I actually took that into like more kind of work world type jobs. Like I realized that I was good at coming up with ideas, and I could be the person to like throw out ideas that other people would shoot down and say, no, that's not the way we're going to do it. We should do it this way. But they couldn't see that until they'd seen that I had a bad idea. You know what I mean? Like I kind of realized that I had a skill there, and that I could provide it for myself, and that I could provide it for other people. And doing that New York Times job was kind of what made me realize that I had that.
I saw another question around that row. Was I wrong? Yes.
Are you going to do more watercolor comics?
Are you going to do more watercolor comics?
I don't know. It was really hard and time consuming, and it achieved what I wanted, but I actually think it helped me become better at drawing. Just that whole like, I mean, it's so like basic art school stuff, but that whole idea of like edges as opposed to lines, and it changed. I feel like it changed the way I draw a little bit, and I think that's what I'm going to take away. I don't really see myself pursuing the watercolor much.
We have one here. Jim Kelso asks.
Uncle Jim.
It says Gene Sousa here.
Oh, Gene. Hi, Gene.
Gene Sousa here. Do your dreams respond back to your comics? That's a good
Whoa. question. I don't think they do, Gene. I actually, during the pandemic, started keeping more of an intentional dream journal, because I don't know about you guys, but there was a moment when the pandemic entered my dream life. Like there was this lag of maybe like a month into the pandemic. My dream life didn't know there was a pandemic, but then one day it knew, and then I had all these pandemic dreams. So my dream life definitely knows about the real world, but I don't think my dream life knows about my comics.
I saw hands in the audience here. Yes.
As an artist, I'm wondering, have you ever encountered the ego? Has it been, has it ever been an impediment in your process?
My ego?
Yes.
Indeed.
As an artist, have you encountered the ego?
Yes. Yes. Let's see. Can I elaborate in some way? Well, when I started doing comics, I was in college down at Evergreen in Olympia. I was in a scene where everybody was doing zines. And so I sort of thought of my comic as a zine. But then I moved to Seattle and I was informed by John Lewis that what I was doing was mini comics. And there was a whole world, he told me, of mini comics. And there's this magazine called Fact Sheet 5 that was just a listing of every mini comic being done in the whole world. And you could like send, it said how much money to send and the address to like order a comic. It was like this whole world that I was part of that I didn't even know about. And then soon after that, I sort of became aware of Fantagraphics in Seattle. Like I knew Fantagraphics comics were out in the world, but I didn't make the connection that they were actually in the same city I lived in until I'd been there for a while. And there was this real divide at the time between self-publishing and people who were self-publishing and people who were published. And I just really got this big chip on my shoulder about being a self-published cartoonist and like feeling weirdly superior, just dumb ego shit. So I think I have a kind of a lot, and I'm quick to get a chip on my shoulder about all kinds of stuff. And it's not one of my favorite qualities in myself, but I think that's my ego being a real impediment.
Yes.
You talked about in your work childhood being very important, and specifically like your childhood home. When you had a child, did you feel like that fed into your work in any way, and your own sense of childhood that maybe fed into your work?
Well, I mean, Virginia was a baby when I did Watergate Sue. So the fact that like there's a lot about pregnancy in that book, that had been such a recent experience for me. But she herself and her childhood I hadn't been with it long enough really for it. Like, it was really my childhood that I'm drawing from in that story. And the way I drew babies, I think, was informed by her. I'm really proud of how I drew the babies in that story. But I've been shy about what about her is in my comics.
I guess, less like reflecting her experience, but like maybe the way it would make you reflect on your own more, or
well,
less,
I think that once you have a kid, whether you want to or not, it shuts the door on your childhood.
Yeah, right.
Because you have to be the grown-up. And I didn't want to be a grown-up, and I avoided a lot of the markers of adulthood for as long as I could. But then when I had a kid, it was like, okay, if you're going to be a decent parent, you kind of have to draw that line. And so I actually think that maybe my comics, since having a kid, have become a little more sympathetic to my parent characters. Sometimes my mom would say that I was a little harsh because she knew, that like some of that was her. So yeah, I guess I like to think that maybe I've become a little more sympathetic to my parent characters over the years.
There's a question here. Paula asks, can you talk a little bit about Bottle Cap Girl? I think your Girlhero comics.
Yeah. So my first comic that I self-published, Girlhero, I published 6 issues of it, and it had an ongoing story. So half of each issue was an episode of the ongoing story, Bottle Cap, and then the other half would be like 1 or 2 short stories. And it was like the Dan Clowes model, like the 8-ball model, because he was doing like he did a few long stories in 8-ball and then had these short backup stories. And so Bottle Cap was sort of me processing everything I learned in college. I went to Evergreen. There were no majors, but I mostly majored in history and political science. And I studied under a lot of Marxist historians, and I took feminist theory and labor history. And so this was back when I thought, like, to be taken seriously, I needed to do like intellectual superhero stories. So I had these 3 female superheroes, and it's this feminist labor epic saga where they, fight the bosses and, go on the lam. And anyway, I kind of painted myself into a narrative corner with that story. And the farther I got into it, the less I enjoyed it. And it just kind of felt like this slog to the finish line. And while that was happening, I was really kind of starting to get into a groove with the short stories, and kind of realized from doing those 6 issues of Girlhero, that I'm kind of cut out more for doing short stories than long epics.
That actually leads into a question I'd like to ask, where maybe another contrast besides it being an epic is that there's it's more antagonist sort of, it's a conflict with a good side and a bad side in that story. And I think when you were talking about Cats in Service, I think a feature of your work that I recognize and that you've touched on a little is, maybe I'm using a word, maybe you'd use a different word, but from story to story, there's always compassion and empathy and understanding of different perspectives of characters. But then rereading your book, there's also a moment where someone like Nixon figures into things, and I don't see I don't see an attempt made to maybe, also have sympathy for a figure like that. Maybe that was in a previous draft or something like that. But I wonder if there's been a character that you've tried to bring into a story, that you've tried to see their side of things, or try to write them in the way that you write your other characters, and you've been unable to, or if characters like that, personalities like that, don't end up figuring in to what you want to say.
Oh, wow, that's a big question. Well, so Bottle Cap is a good example. There's like, the bosses and they're very like one note characters. They don't really have names. They're just bad, evil, terrible men who oppress these women workers. And that's part of what I think I sort of stopped enjoying about that work, was it just was kind of simplistic. Let's face it. I mean, they were sort of polemical, and I just realized this just wasn't where I was at. It wasn't ever what I'd like to read. It wasn't the kind of movies I like to see. So like, what was I doing here in this, and I kind of pretty quickly into like learning how to make comic stories realized that it was really easy to create a cipher character that was just a device to help your main characters get somewhere narratively that you needed them to go. And it just always felt really gross to like have those types of characters. Like, I mean, sure, you can have minor characters, you can have people in crowd scenes, but like if you're gonna have someone walking and talking and interacting, but they're just a paper cutout to like move the story along, I just realized like I really want to avoid that as much as I can. And so then if you're trying to avoid that, like you kind of have to like develop some compassion for them because you've decided that they're a real character in the story. And you need to allow them some complexity. And I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are. I
but-
think a lot of people think they're doing that in their stories to you know, they're like, of course you have to have compassion for your ensemble. I don't see it as, I think sometimes what I see with your stories is that that's thought of in the way that everyone attempts to think about it, but you do it to a degree that it starts, the narrative itself depends on the, I think maybe sometimes people are like, okay, time to inject the compassion into this character. All right, I think I've put enough in there, but yours are done in a way where it starts affecting, as it should, affecting the narrative itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the egg room and the young hot guy at the gourmet food store, I really struggled with that. Like, I don't know. He might still be a bit of a cipher. But like, I had to go to some odd places with him to like try to give him a little more than just being the hot guy at the food store. I tried. I don't know. You guys will be the judge, but I'm getting tired. I don't think I can answer any more questions.
That's fine. That's a perfect way to end things.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thanks you guys so much. And again, thank you to Unnameable Books for hosting this. Next week, the symposium will have Wano Pratap, but that's not of concern to you guys. Thanks. Megan is signing books out there, and you can get her book and make sure to sign up for Unnamable's other events. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
Oh, of course, of course. All right, bye, you guys.
So great. Thank you.